Hello, Taylor Elwood here, and welcome to the Mature Masculinity Podcast. I'm about to have my guest, Lady Drasmin, come on. And Lady Drasmin is someone that I met recently in real life. It turns out that we live really close to each other. And so it's kind of a funny little thing when we started to get to know each other and found that there was some matching parallels in terms of just the inner work that she was doing on her side of the feminine and my side of the masculine. So I thought I would interview her here on the Men's Mysteries because this isn't just about working on ourselves as men, it's also about working on ourselves in relationship with other people. And I'm really super excited about this show. Now, if you're enjoying the show, what I would love is if you would take the time to, if you're on YouTube, to like it and comment on it, and if you're on Substack, to give it a heart and to restack it with a note and share it with the people that you're um, connected with, because that's what's going to help make this podcast even better, and it's going to allow me to get even more guests on here. And Lady Drasmin will be here with us momentarily, but in the meantime, I also want to mention that if you haven't picked up a copy yet of my book, The Quest for Mature Masculinity, go ahead to my website, inneralchemycoach.com, go to the books, and click on Quest for Mature Masculinity. You can get an autographed copy from me and get started reading and change your life from the inside out by working to become the inner sovereign of your life. I've also got an upcoming class called the Sovereign Code, which is going to be coming out temporarily or going to be coming out this year. And I'm super excited about that. It is my newest course. It is a year-long course designed to help you transform your life from the inside out by becoming the sovereign of your life. So, if you're interested in all of that, go ahead to inneralchemycoach.com and check out those offerings, and I look forward to working with you. All right, joining me now is the fantastic, the amazing, the magical Lady Drasmin. Welcome to the Men's Mysteries podcast.
Thank you so much, Taylor, for having me here. Truly, truly a blessing to be here today and to connect with the Brotherhood from this seat.
Thank you. So, you and I have been talking a lot lately. We're doing some interesting work. We happen to live in the same town, which I think is awesome. And one of the things we ended up talking about was the relationship of the wounded feminine and the wounded masculine. So, I was wondering if we could explore that today on this podcast and talk about that because I think it's a huge issue in terms of how men and women relate to each other and sometimes they don't even realize how much they're operating from a place of woundedness in relationship with each other.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I can only speak to the wounded feminine because I am only in the feminine body in this timeline. But from my personal experience and from work I've done with the women in my circles and with clients, the biggest way I've shown the wounded feminine shows up is in control, either hyper control or not having boundaries. Like there's two extremes that the feminine body seems to oscillate within of I'm just going to hyper control this situation and try to micromanage everything and really step into that masculine energy, or I'm going to just be passive and not have any boundaries and just live in resentment but put on that good girl, pleasing face.
Yeah, I think coming at it from the wounded masculine, I actually do see some similarities. I kind of see it as the nice guy as far as like that, I'm gonna give up control. I'm gonna have resentment, but I'll put on a smile and be like all like happy and everything because hey, that'll make it work. Or yeah, that domineering, I have to be totally in control and I have to be the one, I have to take a top-down approach and make this person do what I want. And it creates this really unhealthy dynamic. So it's interesting because in a very real sense, it's a human problem, albeit it's a human problem where there's some gendered aspects that come into play.
Yeah, and I love that you said that it's a human problem because at the end of the day, we all have the masculine and the feminine energy. And just because someone is in the feminine body doesn't mean that they are feminine dominant in their energy and vice versa. And there's also this other aspect of, how do we dance between the energies? Like, for example, within my life, with my work, with my legacy, I'm very much in the masculine energy. Yet in relationship with my partner, I'm very much in the feminine energy. But it requires the masculine to know how to show up. If the feminine is giving him counsel, she's not in her feminine, she's in her masculine. That's not a healthy dynamic of exchange.
What's interesting too, because I've been thinking about this in relationship to we used that word control earlier, and the problem, of course, with control is that if I'm trying to control, I'm trying to control somebody else, and that person has their own feelings, their own thoughts, their own autonomy. And no matter what kind of relationship dynamic you have, whether you have a vanilla dynamic or a kink dynamic or something else along those lines, there's a key word that comes into play, which is consent, in
Hmm.
terms of like how that would even operate. But the other key word, and this is the one I think is really even more important, is influence. I would rather be in a relationship with somebody where I'm open to being influenced by them and I know they're open to being influenced by me.
Hmm. So let's unpack that word influence, right? Because some people hearing that might say, "Oh, that's manipulation." So let's talk about like what is the key difference between influence and manipulation, both from the receiving and from the giving aspect.
Okay, so yeah. I think the difference is that if I'm operating from like the nice guy place, I'm manipulating. I might have wants that I have or desires as an example, but I'm not speaking up for them. I'm expecting that the other person is going to somehow know them. That's what we call covert contracts. Like, I have this covert contract in place that you're just going to know that, I want this favorite food cooked today, but I don't say anything. How could you possibly know that?
Hmm.
You don't know that, and then you don't cook it, and then I get upset and everything else, and that's manipulation at that point.
Hmm.
Whereas with influence, I could the which is I think the healthier version. It's saying, "Hey, I would really like it if we created this spinach casserole today. Maybe we could work on it together. I'm really in the mood to have that." And then I mean, at that point, you can say, yeah, I'm not in the mood, or yeah, that would be great. Let's make that together. But the difference is that is influence. It's not manipulation. I'm being honest about my want, and you have the chance to hear that and then decide if that's something you want to do or not. And just because I can voice a want or you can voice a want doesn't mean that either of us is going to automatically get a yes.
Hmm. So it's like influence is an invitation, even if it's a subtle or a quote unquote indirect invitation, whereas manipulation is a demand or a silent expectation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way to sum it up. And so it kind of creates this really interesting dynamic where if we're able to come together and just speak really openly, which is something you and I do really well with each other, I might add, it works out really well. Because then it's like, okay, I have a clear understanding of what you want, and I can hear that, and then I can choose whether or not I want to follow through on that. And if I don't want to follow through on that, then I can say that. And sometimes it can even involve recognizing like where there's a mismatch. That was something that you and I discovered shortly after we met. Like we connected and we talked about like some possibilities and we realized there was a mismatch in one area that would prevent us from moving in one direction, but it allowed us to move into this really wonderful friendship that we're developing and business
Mhm.
partnership as well.
Mhm. And I feel like that's the key, one of the key takeaways I would love our audience to receive today is like the key sign of someone who is maybe not necessarily healed, right? Because we always have like things to work on and layers to declutter as we are in this current timeline. But the ability to have eye contact, heart-to-heart conversations about whatever it is and knowing enough of self to know that I am in a space to have this conversation or to hold space for this conversation or not right now. And if it's not right now, then people really ought to be doing their self-work and not dating or sleeping around.
Or anything else for that matter. I mean, I think that not right now can apply beyond even just that. If it's not right now, like to a business thing, or it's not right now to
Mhm,
a friendship or something along those lines, well, okay, then let's really sit with that and figure out where that woundedness is coming into play.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
and I think that there's nothing wrong with being able to say, yeah, not right, this isn't the right time, or maybe this isn't the right match,
mhm,
and exploring what the right match could be. I think that's a really healthy way to approach things. And yet there seems to always be this all or none pressure. And I think on both sides, honestly.
mhm,
But I mean, certainly what I observe in men a lot of times is there's this all or none pressure. Like, okay, it has to be this way or else, or I'm
mhm,
not going to have anything to do with this person.
mhm,
Well, right there, you're already cutting off a wide range of experiences and
mhm,
connections and deep heart to heart relationship just because you want one thing
mhm.
instead of something else.
Yeah. I mean, life is not black and white. Life and death are the black and white natures of duality, but like what happens within life, what happens within our sacred yes, beyond our no, can really allow for more of the that color spectrum to come online.
Yeah, so when you are encountering someone who's in their wounded feminine, what are some of the concerns or issues that they have in both in relationship to themselves, in relationship to other women, and in relationship to men? And I know that's a three-tiered question, but here we don't do things simple.
Here we dive deep. We dive deep. You can catch up, pause the video, grab a cup of coffee, rewind.
That's right.
Um, so let's start with the first part of that. The biggest concern that the beings, I'm going to speak for women, but I really like to use the word beings, um, I encounter is not being heard. Instead of just like being validated in our experience, well, that's not what happened. Or I disagree. Well, that's fine that you disagree. It's that bridge of can you just listen and accept that this is my truth without making it your truth. And because that frequency doesn't emanate based on the person's the other's actions, history, so on and so forth. And ultimately, like we can feel, right? We can feel where there is authentic receptivity versus someone's just like rolling their eyes in their head and just counting down the tickets so they can speak. And this actually, this problem that I kept encountering of women in relationships, in friendships, in just connection, were having a hard time being heard is what inspired the ABC. One of the big things that inspired the ABC check-in. It's just a model of communication I created and have developed over the years that creates a container for regular checking in. The biggest thing I can only say towards like how to navigate that is like validating self and recognizing that self-validation is the most important. And then through that deeper acceptance of self, then we naturally attract men and women into our worlds that can hold that mirror of validation because they have validated themselves. We can only show up and we can only give to the depth that we have given and shown up for ourselves.
It's so funny you say that because I was reading this article on Substack from the Awakened Feminine, and she made that point. She made it in regards to men. She said that men can only love women as much as they love themselves. And I thought, well, really, that applies to people, but I thought it was a great point. And you mentioned the ABC check-in, and I actually have the card right here. And this is something that's on your site, so for people, but this is so cool. So talk to us a little bit about this. What is the ABC check-in?
So this ABC check-in is just a wheel of conversation that helps create bite-sized conversation and also like break it up into manageable chunks. So we go through the letters A through H. It can be applied in a vast range of relationships. It can be, small and quick, just ABC, and we don't have to do all the letters. But we start with appreciation. And it's a practice that helps create active listening. When someone's appreciating, then we listen to their appreciation. We learn how to receive, and there's a practice for receiving as well, a quick one I can share. And then the other person takes turn. And in between the turns, we take a breath and really like neutralize the space so that then we can appreciate and be appreciated and vice versa. And then, if you can go around the room, if there's a group of people, everyone is appreciating, everyone is appreciated. And then we go into the next round, which is B, bridges and boundaries. Boundaries are hard lines, do not cross. If you cross, this connection is over. These are my non-negotiables. And then there are bridges. They are the places where we can be a little fluid, where we can be influenced. Okay, this is my boundary with a friendship, but it's a bridge for a relationship. So we start to learn about our own gray areas by cultivating our boundaries and bridges. And then we go into C, which is clarities and concerns. This is a good space to unpack a situation or an experience. Or if it's a business or a community house meeting, these are the clarities for the events that's happening or whatever's going on. These are my concerns. This incident happened. What's really going on? And then we go into D. D's are desires and needs using I statements. Disclaimer, asking for something is not a guarantee that that need is going to be met. It's simply knowing that I have asked this. It is safe to voice my needs and my wants, and somebody else's no is not a reflection of shame or guilt. It's simply that they're not in a space to give that to me. And then
It's not a rejection.
it's not a rejection, right? Right. It's their own sovereignty at work. And then we go F or E, which is emotions. Is there an emotion that you're navigating right now that you'd like to be witnessed in, supported in, or not? And the letter E is usually like cut out if we just want a quick check-in, unless, that is the whole point of the check-in. And then F is final thoughts, anything that doesn't fit in those categories. And then with G, we close with gratitude. One gratitude for self, one gratitude for the space, and one gratitude for the other person. And then H is hold hands, hug, say hi and bye, bow. And the way I've introduced this check-in, like it's really important to have this consistently at the same time every day. It's like going to the doctor, the communication doctor. So you want to do this weekly or bi-weekly. I do not recommend more than 2 weeks because then things start to build up. And in between, you have space for play and pleasure. You're not going to be bombarded with emotional processing, trauma, info dumping. You're just trying to make your oatmeal and coffee, and this person is just chattering on about all their other things that, yeah, you care because you love them. You want to be nice and show up, right? So this also helps with fine tuning where we are nice, right? Like, yeah, it's important to be polite, but not at the expense of self. And so when we create these containers for check-in, it's like, oh, every Friday at 6 o'clock, we're going to sit down and check in and talk about our relationship, talk about our goals, talk about our visions. In between, we can just trust that we can be lighthearted. This also creates room for the inner child to come out. This creates room for the feminine to soften because that ABC check-in is a masculine structure. And this allows room for the masculine to soften because he's not being constantly hit, or rather, that energy is not constantly being hit with things to think of and keep track of.
That's a really good approach. And I like that that both the feminine and the masculine can soften. That there's the container, and at the same time there's also the release,
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah.
which I think is both of them are equally important. I want to know that yes, that the space can be held. That's really important. Got to have
Mhm,
that. But I also want to know that at a certain point that there can be a release and that whatever needs to be processed has been processed, and then we can go back to experiencing that play instead of operating from a place of woundedness where we're like, oh, well, I'm holding a resentment towards you for X, Y, and Z.
mhm, mhm, mhm. And just another thing to share here is like, yeah, it's good to have these regular check-ins, but sometimes things come up and need to be addressed. And how do we navigate that? We ask. Again, this comes to Um, just communicating, hey, something's come up. I need a quick check-in. Do you have space in the next 10 minutes or at the end of the day, right? It's about recognizing that we all have this bubble that we're in. Really, it's about two arms width length, if you think about it. Um, and we just need to be approached with the same respect that we would give. But we don't know the respect to give until we learn how to create that respect for self.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, that kind of comes to a principle that I've really been applying to my life, which is that the garden of love is watered by self-respect. When I
Mm,
respect myself, then I'm able to love myself. And when I'm able to do that, I'm also able to show up with love for the other people in my life because I'm
mhm,
operating from that place of respect and sovereignty as opposed to just operating from a place of victimhood.
mhm, mhm, mhm. And it does take a certain amount of courage to acknowledge that we're adults, but still very much trapped in the child body. Right? Because again, there's the societal expectation. So here we've been talking about like the expectations of the masculine and the feminine to each other and for each other. But there's also this societal conditioning that has been browbeaten quite literally in some parts of the world to engage with the opposite sex. Like in the Hispanic culture and even the Indian culture that my parents are descendant from, there's this expectation, and I was actually raised with this mindset of a woman's role is to only speak when spoken to. Your role is to cook, clean, sew, give your child father, give your husband babies, and that's it. And so there's also like societal conditioning to consider when we engage with someone of the opposite sex. It's not enough to look at what body parts they have. It's also important to look at their cultural background. And at the risk of, bringing in race into this, color of skin is a very obvious indicator,
Hmm.
and there's not enough consideration. Like we talk about consent, but I feel like that topic of consent has so many deeper layers into it. There's like trauma informed consent, there is race informed consent, there is gender informed consent, right? And these are like considerations to start tapping into before we start engaging with another person, another being, another sovereign, because only to the level of self-awareness can we then be aware for another.
That's true. And I think that it's also like there's a real call there to be aware of that. Like I know as a white man, one of the things that I have to carry with me is like, you know, how my background is going to be different from other people. And what am I bringing into that? What's the implicit bias? What are the assumptions? What are the things that I don't know? For example, you know, my lived experience is not the same as yours. And it's not even just a case of being different genders, it's also, in our particular case, different races and different cultural backgrounds. That plays a role in how in the interactions. And so being aware of that, you're 100% correct. Like that is such an important thing. And I think it's also important to recognize that like it's that this wounding sometimes can go back generations. It's ancestral sometimes. Like it's not something that's just it's not just, oh, I got wounded when I was a kid. Yes, I did. It's also, okay, here's the way that this showed up for my ancestors.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely. And on the topic of privilege, I had this profound realization earlier this year, and it really humbled me. And when it comes to privilege, we too often like think of wealth privilege,
Hmm.
but there's also a poverty privilege. There's expectation that because someone is in a certain tax bracket, because someone is from a certain part of the world, a certain culture, they are obligated certain reparations from the world at large.
Hmm.
So it's like that's another sign of like the woundedness, right? Operating from poverty privilege of of just that sickly codependent expectation of support instead of stepping into self-empowerment.
Yeah. No, I can see that, and I think and it is interesting to see that. I mean, there's some, I guess I would say class privilege with that as well, maybe. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Now, one of the things that you also talked about, you mentioned it earlier, and I want to come back to it, is you talked about the ability to receive and that you have a process for that. Can we talk a little bit about receiving?
Mm.
Because this is something that I see that a lot of men struggle with, and
Mm.
I'm curious as to your perspective with that as well.
Yeah, so first I'm going to give a shout out to one of my teachers who shared this practice with me. I had her on a pedestal, as we put most of our teachers. Just a very, very human thing to do, to pedestalize someone that we perceive has greater or more than us. And I had the opportunity of meeting Shamli Arda in Portland almost a decade ago. And I was just all fluttery and nerves and just talking miles a minute and praising her. And she put a hand on my shoulder and she's like, "Is this okay?" And that was the first time like I connected with her. The fact that she asked me consent, woman to woman, if she could place a hand on my shoulder. And I was like, "Oh, of course." And then she invited me into a little breath while she stood there. And she said, "Did you hear what I just said?" And I said, you asked me if you could put your hand on my shoulder. She said, "No, I said, thank you." Oh, and then I said, "Oh, thank you for what?" And she's like, "Just thank you. Thank you for being. Thank you."
Hmm.
And I was so uncomfortable in the moment. And she could see that in my face. I was like thinking, my brain was going, this was pre-ABC check-in days. And she looked at me. She said, "May I share with you a practice of receiving?" I said, "Okay." She said, "Whenever someone says something to you, a kind word, an acknowledgement, an answer to a response, even if they say no, place a hand on your heart and one on your belly and take a breath in and just receive whatever they said in the moment and then let it go. And on the second breath, receive it and voice that deeply received and then let it go. And then you take a third breath to neutralize the field within you.
Hmm.
And that circuit, those three breaths, with the middle one of just deeply received, can help you come back into the feminine body of receiving, which
Hmm.
is so necessary for the health of the masculine body. Because when the masculine feels appreciated, he rests.
Hmm.
And so I started applying that. Like I just started doing that with myself. Like, deeply received. I started doing that with my food and with different things that would show up in my life. And now I share this practice when people I meet, especially when the ADHD mind or the anxiety kicks in. I'm like, put a hand on your shoulder and I do the same thing. Is that okay? And now I share this practice. And all beings watching this video to start practicing that within ourselves. Whatever emotions are coming up, receive those emotions. Whatever thoughts are coming up, receive those thoughts. Whatever discomfort is arising, receive that discomfort. And it's going to be uncomfortable, right? Because we're not just like learning how to receive in this body, in this timeline, we are receiving for our ancestors. We are creating the safe space for our ancestors by allowing ourselves to receive.
Yeah. It's interesting. One, I've noticed you say deeply received before, and now I appreciate even more like what the history is behind that. And I would say that only in the last year or two have I even become comfortable with receiving. Like it was something where I had a realization one day. I'm like, I always say thank you after someone, says something nice to me, or I always praise them back. Like I'm giving the gold back to them instead of actually receiving and allowing that gold to settle into my being. And so one day I just started saying, I receive this. And that's what
Mm,
I've started doing, just
mhm,
saying, when someone gives me something, I receive this. And
mhm,
I don't just say thank you right back or anything like that. I actually just really allow it to
mhm,
hit me
mhm,
and to come into my presence and being and allow it to sink in
mhm,
and
mhm,
validate me. And at the same time, I don't rely upon that validation. At the end of
mhm,
the day, self-validation, folks, that's the key. But
mhm,
still, being able to receive something is so essential. And it actually, I think it's also helped me recognize when I don't want to receive something so I can
mhm.
put better boundaries up.
Yes, yes. And I love that you shared that part because on one hand, taking a moment to receive really allows us to drop in and also starts to break the cycle of regurgitated response. Oh, you look so nice. Oh, you look so nice. Oh, you look so nice. Oh my God, you're so awesome. Oh my gosh, you're so awesome. And especially as women, we can really banter in that way. But again, it's very disempowering because you're just like throwing the gold back at each other. And then it's just, it starts to lose its value.
I see the same thing actually happen with men as
Oh,
well. Like,
does
yeah,
it?
yeah, totally. I see it happen a lot. Like when I go to like men's weekends and stuff, each man will be like, "Oh, thank you," da da da. And I said to one man recently at a weekend, I just said, because he'd done some really powerful work, and I said, keep some of that gold for yourself. You did that work.
Mhm.
Yes, somebody helped facilitate it, has someone helped, but keep some of that for you. Like you can
Mhm.
acknowledge and appreciate that person that guided you, but you did that work. You're the one who did that work.
It took me 5 years after Shamali shared this practice with me before I started doing it with other people. It took me 5 years to just get comfortable with receiving myself.
Hmm.
And I was doing this, multiple times a day. And I love that piece that you shared about, and even now, as I continue to learn deeper ways of receiving, I continue to discover growing edges. This past week was definitely challenging. But I love how you shared, this allows us space to recognize what we don't want to receive, right? Because sometimes somebody can say something nice, but their energy could be in a very not good place, not very nice place. And when we allow ourselves to drop in and really listen in, then we can really hear the energy and intention behind what someone is saying. And we can be empowered to say, I really appreciate your well-meaning intention, but it doesn't sit well with me. So I do not receive that. And it starts to like break this perception that we have to accept all the good stuff and then we reject all the bad stuff. When in fact it's not so black and white. Sometimes the bad stuff is divine protection and redirection. Like, can we receive the no with as much grace as and excitement as we receive the yes?
That's a great point. It is exciting to receive the no when you step out of rejection, when you step out of that thing of entitlement. Because to me, rejection seems to be based in entitlement. Like I'm owed something. So, like, someone doesn't give it to me, I feel rejected. Oh, they've rejected my being. They've rejected what whatever. But if I can step out of that and be like, well, okay, I can be curious and open and I can discover, well, then there's an adventure there that can be had.
Mhm.
Like, oh, you said no, okay. Can I accept that? Okay, yes, I can accept that. And then maybe we can talk about it later. Maybe it's no, not right now. Maybe it's no, not ever, and that's okay too.
Mhm.
It's and I really liken it to the fact that like when you're open and curious, you actually get to discover a richer experience with the person than if you just try to change that no.
Mhm.
Because if you're open to it, it's like, oh, suddenly I can appreciate this person in all the ways that they are choosing to show up and saying yes to me, because that no actually helps me to see the gold that's right there.
Mhm. 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 Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's these like extremes, and I feel like we're in this timeline, especially with this shift into the Aquarian and Platonic age now. It's like this recalibration of extremes finally like starting to find a middle ground. And I have a distinct privilege, speaking of the word privilege, for having been raised in the East. Like I did a lot of my developmental years in the East in India. And then I did a lot of my late high school collegiate years here in the US. So I have that unique privilege of having been behind the scenes, both culturally and in the education field. And I feel like this is what our big problem in our world is the extremes in the different parts of the world. In the East, it's like hyper discipline, over focus on scholastic studies. There's not really a whole lot of human connection, extremely disciplined. And here in the West, like there's no discipline. What's taught to the children is diluted. Even the food is diluted, right? And so like it's not enough to look at like our mental belief systems and our programs and conditionings and what we've inherited in our DNA with epigenetics, but it's also important to look at like our environment. because it does influence. We're talking about influence here. We're talking about that direct one-on-one influence. But what about the subtle influence of the clothes we wear, of the things that we surround ourselves with, the programming that is just playing in the background that we've become so desensitized to because we've accepted it as our normal. Just because you've accepted it as your normal doesn't mean it's healthy. And there's like that shift that starts to happen of, oh, what am I actually receiving? Oh, I'm deeply receiving what is very vocalized and obvious, but what about the not so obvious things that I'm just like allowing to come through and filter in?
Yeah. No, I hear that. That lands with me really powerfully. I look at it too, like when I started doing a lot of work on myself, to claim my sovereign, just the amount of self-care that I did, the change in the way I dressed, the change in the way that I presented myself, the way that I really started to receive myself and show up in the world changed so much. It was like it was a real personality change that happened because I was like, I want better for myself. Well, who's going to give that to me? I can't wait for someone else to do it. I've got to do it for myself. And then what's been interesting is that the people that I've attracted into my life have really represented that in terms of how they take care of themselves. You're one of those people. So, it's just kind of a really interesting and relevant point that, the way that we take care of ourselves directly does correlate to the types of relationships that we have and the quality of those relationships in our
Mhm,
lives.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and again, the that influence and manipulation comes in. It's like we're when we don't, I feel like that's when the lines start to blur. Like, this is my personal perception of this, but I feel like we're not, when we're choosing, because ultimately our greatest gift in this, in being human, is the gift of choice. Like, yeah, we have all of these possibilities, but until we choose that, and that's what love is a choice every day. You wake up and you choose to love yourself. You wake up and you choose to love your home. You wake up and you choose to love your job. You wake up and you choose to love your partner, and so on and so forth. And then that love is action. That love is presence. That love is patience. That love is self-work. That love is radical responsibility. That love is divine forgiveness. And we have to continue showing up and choosing love. But then there's a point where our environment can start to manipulate our thoughts. And that's when the influence becomes toxic and
Mhm.
caustic. And and it's one of the things that's really surprising me is how people don't clean their homes. And that's like the easiest way to make sure that those lines of influence and manipulation don't get crossed. Because when your environment is clean and organized, then there's space for this internal stuff to breathe. It's not like pressing in and creating more congestion.
Yeah, I clean my home regularly for that reason alone because I feel it feels better. When I go into my bathroom and I have a clean bathroom or my kitchen's clean or whatever else, it's like, okay, this is a holy space. I'm treating it as the temple it really is, and our homes are our temples. And
Absolutely.
they're a reflection of how we treat ourselves. So if I'm
Hmm.
not treating myself well, it's going to show in
Hmm.
my home and how I take care of my home, and vice versa. And
Hmm.
and I treat my home as a living space. So I want to take good care of this living space that I happen to be collaborating and cohabitating with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love how you say the home is a living space, because it really is, right? And if the home that we live in is not a sanctuary, please work on getting out of there, or making it a sanctuary if you can't leave, or if that's where you want to be. And sometimes, and I learned this very, very deeply this year, sometimes it is the environment. I had this distortion within me until recently that as long as I was good on the inside, nothing outside could fuck with me. And
Hmm.
then I had some experiences that showed me, I was like, actually, sometimes it is the environment. And then it
Yeah.
doesn't really matter how much good influence you are on yourself, you're in a prison.
Well, and what you allow, you're responsible for. So if you're in an environment that's not good for you and you're allowing that, then what does that even say about the internal work that you clearly still need to do? You might think that you're good, and you might actually be like, oh, wait a minute, there's some stuff I need to work on here.
Right, right, exactly, exactly. And one of the other things, you mentioned, you asked a question at the beginning, earlier when we first started, and you were talking about like what is a challenge that women have when engaging with the other. Well, the what comes to mind is if you don't have any experience that is healthy, how do you know that something is healthy or unhealthy? If that's your normal, if your normal is to be abused and disrespected and shut down and belittled and dismissed or whatever, if your normal is to be put on a pedestal and to have everything just handed to you without any sense of like how things actually happen and that, it takes time for things to be created, then how do you know that there's something different? And that's where that key piece of curiosity that you, Taylor, were talking about comes in of, oh, we have to allow ourselves to be curious. But that inner child returns naturally when we address those wounds of being rejected, of being cut off, of being ostracized for being different.
Yeah. So where can we find you on the web and tell us about any offerings that you have that you'd like us to know about?
Thank you. Right now, I'm most active on my Facebook page, Drasmin Integrative Alchemy. I just opened a soul salon, my soul salon here in this town that I'm living in, and I host monthly circles here, women's temple, sound circles. Taylor will be starting leading men's council next month, so very exciting to have that balance of the masculine and feminine energy here. And my work, I have very limited one-on-one client seats, but my work is really centric around reclaiming our personal power. I work with the feminine to work on priestess pathways, so that is an option as well. But my focus is really decluttering ancestral trauma, sexual trauma, political programming, religious indoctrination within the DNA template, and providing integrative mind, heart, body, energy resources so that you can be self-empowered to really reclaim your king or queendom and discover your joy, not because I'm telling you what your mission is, but because that truth arises from that well of integrated masculine and feminine energy, which then allows the curiosity to come in, and then the curiosity will lead you down the rabbit hole to all the possibilities.
Oh, that sounds so good. Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show. And what I always like to do is have one final question, which is what final words of wisdom do you have to share with us today that we can take with us into the rest of the day?
Breathe, drink water, and learn to listen. Really listen. But breathing and drinking water is important first, because if we're dehydrated and we're not breathing, we can't really listen.
No, we really can't. I've got water right here. I'm hydrating and I'm breathing.
Cheers, everybody. Let's do a water toast. Clink, clink,
Clink,
clink.
clink, clink. All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show, and I will look forward to having you back on again at some point. All right. That was the amazing Lady Drasmin. You can find her website underneath in the show notes here, so go check that out. And again, please, if you're on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe, like, comment on this video. If you're on Substack, go ahead and give it a heart and restack it. That's what helps get this work out to more people, and it's what helps us to create a healthier, more embodied world for both the masculine and the feminine. The men's mysteries, yes, it's about men's work, but I also think there has to be an intersection at times for that work with the feminine, and this is a good example of that. Thanks for watching and have an excellent rest of your day.